Hello all. Come and join me round my flickering flame. I'm so glad to see that you have returned to continue our tale. Nothing could do more to warm the heart of an old bard with a passion for magic. When last we left Embrosk, he was yet again lost in the depths of the Cadman wilderness. And he had encountered an elf who had saved him from a potentially dangerous encounter with a swamp creature. And now I again invite you to come with me as we join our hero in his trials and in his triumphs, in this grand tale of gold, bones, and leather. The fleet-footed elf started walking with purpose, while Embrosk, teetering and unbalanced, stumbled after him. Soon the elf was out of sight. Luckily, his bare feet left clear prints in the mud, and Embrosk continued after the elf, who did not slow down. Embrosk had only made it several hundred yards when he was already certain that the elf had abandoned him. He cursed out loud as he tried to muster the strength to pull his foot out of the now ankle-deep mud. He looked around him and cursed again. He couldn't see any more footprints. He groaned and renewed his effort to free his foot from the trappings in the mud. "That's the spirit," the elf's voice said from above him. Embrosk looked up to see the elf perched on one of the limbs of a tall tree. "Just pull a little harder and you'll get it out," the elf chirped, laughing. Embrosk gritted his teeth and pulled with all his might, freeing his foot with a loud, unpleasant squelch. Embrosk opened his mouth to ask the elf what the hell he was doing in a tree, but the question hadn't even left his mouth when the elf launched himself out of the tree, doing a front flip before landing on his feet. "I was just waiting for you to catch up," the elf said, turning to Embrosk and winking. "Come on, we're almost to some solid ground." The elf laughed again, seemingly without reason, and bounded forward through the muck. After a few seconds, he was again out of sight. Indeed, after another 100 yards or so, Embrosk felt the ground beneath his feet begin to harden, and the elf's footprints became slightly harder to make out. He shook his head and continued to navigate forward after the strange elf, aiming for a slight incline that looked like it might be the start of a stretch of dry ground. His feet felt heavier with every step that he took, and he again found himself wondering why he was trudging along after this complete stranger. Still, he followed. He reached the incline and struggled up it, falling twice in the process. He shuffled a couple steps forward, trying to make out any footprints. That was when his vision began to blur, and he fell to his knees. The bag of books slipped from his hands and hit the ground with a loud thump. "Well, that's not the fighting spirit I was looking for," chirped the elf's voice from directly above Embrosk. Embrosk groaned out loud and rubbed his eyes, hoping to clear them of their fogginess. He knew he would not be able to get up again. The elf again launched himself back down from the tree where he had been sitting. "I think this might be far enough," the elf said lightly, as if he could read Embrosk's mind. As always, his voice contained a slight lilt of laughter. "Wait here a moment, and I'll be right back." He brushed aside another curtain of vines and bounded off into the distance, whistling a strange tune. Embrosk blinked hard, trying to wrap his mind around the nature of this strange companion, who certainly did not match up with what Embrosk had read about elves. In Sandom, elves were known as the silent creatures of the night, sly and vicious. Some even said that the elves did not speak, but instead communicated only with their minds, which were all magically connected. Still, Embrosk needed to find his way home, and if the elf could help him at all, he would gladly take, well, at this stage he would gladly take anything. And, after all, Embrosk's experiences with ogres had taught him to ignore many stories that humans told. Embrosk's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of the elf's bounding return with a large bag slung over his shoulder, the contents of which clanged together with every step he took. "Here we are," the elf said brightly, plopping the bag down right in front of where Embrosk was kneeling in the dirt. The elf crouched down on the ground and began to rummage through its contents. "What are you looking for?" Embrosk asked. The elf ignored him and continued to poke through the sack, biting the inside of his lip as if unsure. He then nodded assuredly to himself and pulled out a crystalline flask, which reflected the light of the rays of sun that broke through the thick ceiling of trees. "Drink this," the elf said brightly, handing the flask to Embrosk. Embrosk took the flask suspiciously and removed the cork so he could examine its silvery blue contents. It was definitely a potion, but Embrosk was quite sure he didn't recognize it. He brought it up to his nose and sniffed. It smelled of fennel. He quickly went through his mental encyclopedia of potions, trying to figure out exactly what this might be. Sniffing it again, he detected an underlying scent of cherry. He looked up at the elf. "What is it?" The elf laughed. Just drink it." Embrosk thought about it for a moment before trying to hand it back to the elf. "I'm not sure I want to." The elf laughed again, taking a step back from Embrosk's outstretched hand. "It's not a potion you would recognize, so describing it to you won't ease your fears in any way." "What makes you say I wouldn't recognize it?" Embrosk asked, somewhat defensively. "Because I made it myself, and my recipes are different from yours," the elf retorted, bringing himself up to his full, rather unimpressive height. "I thought elves couldn't do physical magic," Embrosk said suspiciously. The elf narrowed his eyes. "Well, you thought wrong. Now drink the potion." "I don't even know your name, but you expect me to just drink whatever you hand me?" "Yes," the elf said shortly, meeting Embrosk's gaze. "Although, if it makes you feel better, my name is Abio." Embrosk glanced down at the flask in his hand and up again at the stubborn elf. Without really thinking, he brought the flask to his lips and drank it. The potion seared the inside of his throat. There was a harsh burning sensation in his gut, which quickly simmered down to a warm glow. As he slowly passed out of consciousness, a thought drifted across his mind. What had the elf said? "My potions are different from yours?" How would he have known what potions Embrosk made? The thought lingered for a moment before drifting away, as Embrosk fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Far away, in the human kingdom of Sandom, Felin stood in the dusty interior of Embrosk's old potion shop, the frown on his face deepening. He adjusted the hat he used to cover his horns, and he moved into the back room. Something wasn't right, and Felin didn't need to be a genius to figure out what it was. Embrosk should have arrived back in Sandom a month ago, but he was nowhere to be found. The herbs that filled the jars on Embrosk's shelves had dried up long ago, and every piece of furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. Looking around at it, the shop had been undisturbed for many years. Where might Embrosk be, Felin wondered. Someone with a mind like his surely wouldn't have gotten lost. Surely wouldn't have been so foolish as to stray from the path. Perhaps he had chosen not to come back. Despite the human size and intellectual disposition, he certainly did seem to have a taste for adventure. But somehow, Felin didn't think this was the case. When he and Embrosk had last spoken, Embrosk had mentioned a promise that needed keeping, the reason for his return home. Embrosk was not one to break a promise. Felin was sure to scan the packed dirt road for passengers before leaving the house through the back door. Though his large blue hat covered his horns, he knew that any second look would immediately distinguish him as an ogre. While Sandom was more forgiving than most human countries, he could never be too careful. He knew several ogres who had been run out of the country by mobs of angry humans. Seeing the road clear of other users, he slipped across it and into the trees that lay beyond. The trees were short and thin, probably planted no more than 5 years before. A dry forest kingdom, Sandom was particularly prone to wildfires. Therefore, the trees were either young like these, planted after the most recent fire, or old, tall trees with thick trunks that had somehow survived for decades, even centuries. He treaded lightly on the balls of his feet, padding soundlessly over the thick cushion of pine needles on the floor. Back in Nganga, he had learned to move without being heard or being seen. The reason for that training was simple. It made him better at killing humans, elves, and other ogres. Felin was not just a hunter of large game and dangerous beasts, though he was frequently employed for those purposes. He also occasionally ventured into human territory to search for something far less elusive, but far more difficult to tame: storytellers. For decades, the ogres had been developing a highly secretive relationship with the bards and minstrels of the northern human kingdoms. Felin fingered the long wooden flute that was tucked into one of the many pockets on the inside of his long woolen cloak. If he decided to continue with his mission, that would be his bargaining chip. It had been enchanted many years ago by a man who was skilled in physical magic. Felin would trade it to a bard for the opportunity to have a story of his choice written into song. That song would contain grand stories about the knowledge of Botsere, hopefully enticing young, magically gifted humans like Embrosk to embark on the journey to the mountains of the north. Felin's shoulders slumped as he thought about his missing friend. He had been given a mission by the Werig, and she would be upset if he did not venture forward to his target, the town of Cernt. However, Felin knew that something was very wrong, and if he was to fix it, time was of the essence. He shook his head. He had been excited to be sent to Cernt, a town not too far from Embrosk's shop. By now, he was supposed to be relaxing by a fire, trading stories with the peculiar, yet infinitely fascinating human. Instead, he was left making the choice between his mission and his friend. Although, there really was no choice in the matter. Felin's clan upbringing had taught him loyalty above all other principles, and in Felin's clan, highest loyalty was not to your chieftain, it was to your brother. Felin quickly calculated his position before turning on his heel and taking off north towards the border with Cadman. Back in Cadman, Embrosk was enjoying the first proper night of sleep since that night in the cabin with Felin and the strange ogre woman. It cleansed Embrosk of his perpetual exhaustion. It was dreamless, thoughtless, unencumbered by the weight of worry that had hung over him since the music had guided him off his path into the wilds of the Cadman wilderness. Embrosk was not awake to see the sun rise to its peak in the middle of the day, nor did he see the magnificent blood-red sunset. The stars that night were magnificent, shining through a clear sky, but Embrosk did not bear witness. When finally he awoke to the sound of rambunctious singing, the moon was lazily drifting out of the view to make way for the pale light of the rising sun. Embrosk's eyes drifted open as his sleep failed to drown out the singers. He found himself lying on hard-packed dirt, several feet from a fire, which danced playfully in a makeshift fire pit constructed from large rocks which had been arranged in a circle. 3 elves, silhouetted against the fire, pranced around it, singing at the top of their voices in Drell, the human dialect common to Sandom and its eastern neighbor, Luminare. Embrosk could not tell if Abia was among the elves. The hill where she sat was empty and barren, the queen whose failure was known. She looked quite merry, and her queendom of Tsere was nothing except for a throne. She had been told many years before that her rule would not last long, but taken by madness far prior to sadness, she thought that the sage had been wrong. And as she sat there way up in her chair, the queen of nothing at all, She waved to her court of the invisible sort, just as her sage foresaw. After nearly a full day and full night of proper sleep, Embrosk felt better than he had in a good long while. He ought to wonder what was happening, or who these elves were, or what he was going to do next. But, well rested as he was, he found it difficult to worry about such things. He decided to sit back and enjoy the music. Embrosk did not recognize the tune, but that was not unusual for him. He had not grown up with much music in his household. Still, Embrosk had always been fascinated by music. The histories of the ancient world had been passed down, not in the leather-bound books that Embrosk so desperately clung to, but rather in the words of songs that rang throughout the world, transcending the generations. With that in mind, Embrosk listened to the elves carefully, making a mental note to the lyrics of the song. As he did so, his mind, well trained in history and lore, filled in the gaps left by the music. The song told the story of the first queen of Tsere, the ogre queendom that sat to the west of Botsere. Of the ogre nation villages, Tsere was by far the strangest. For many centuries, Cadman, Tsere, and Botsere had been unified under the rule of the Botserian elders. Only the Ngangan ogres and their warlords stood separate from their kin. While Nganga warred with their elvish and human neighbors, the ogres of Cadman, Tsere, and Botsere adhered to their ancient customs and worked together to collect and dispense the magical knowledge of the world, all in the pursuit of a greater goal, rediscovering magic. These nation villages, united in their vast knowledge of magic, were equally united in their inability to harness it. While humans and elves were born every day with the ability to use personal, physical, and even communal magic, the magic of the ogres seemed to have passed from reality into legend. Eventually Cadman, frequently subject to human raids, split from the alliance and joined Nganga in war against the humans. With no magic to defend themselves and no history of organized warfare, Cadman fell. Botsere had been convinced that Cadman fell because they abandoned their larger quest for magic. Cadman had not waited to learn the grand truths that would have defended their armies and their people. They had been impatient and unwise, and therefore were doomed from the start. One woman in Tsere saw things differently. She believed that Cadman had fallen because they were an inferior civilization. The humans had been well led, well organized, and well equipped. In contrast, she saw that spinelessness and indecision plagued the Botserian system. They could no longer wait for magical abilities that might never come. If they wanted to be safe from elves and humans, they needed to adapt. They needed to become like humans. As she rose in rank, she continued to espouse her beliefs that ogres needed cities, armies, and a monarchy. One day, against the advice of her most trusted followers, she staged a coup and tried to seize power for herself. The allies that she had painstakingly gathered never supported her, and the coup was crushed underfoot. Her name was stricken from the history books, and she was sentenced to die of starvation, chained to a large stone throne atop a lonely hill. The inscription on the throne read, "Here sits the Queen of Nothing. Long may she reign." Ironically, 2 decades later, her vision was achieved. An organized, youthful contingent of Tsere ogres took control of the nation village, split from Botsere, and crowned a queen. The Queen of Tsere had lasted ever since. The elves sped up as they reached their final chorus. And as she sat there way up in her chair, the Queen of Nothing at all, she waved to her court of the invisible sort, just as her sage foresaw. As the elves reached the end of the song, they moved faster and faster, circling their fire in a whir of motion. On the final note of the song, they each sprang into the air. They remained suspended there for what felt like several seconds, before they all landed in perfect unison, hitting the ground with one large thump. "Hello, where am I?" Embrosk called to the elves, figuring that he may as well introduce himself to his new host. The elves turned towards him simultaneously. "You're at our campfire," one chirped, laughing. His voice was higher than Abio's, and he enunciated his words carefully. The elves advanced towards Embrosk, who quickly clambered to his feet. While he had little knowledge of elves, he figured it might be impolite to greet them while lying prone on his back. "And where is this fire?" Embrosk asked lightly, as the elves formed a loose semicircle around him. "In the forest," another added on. This one was female, but her voice was lower and gravelier than her male compatriots. "In Cadman," the third elf stated, laughing. Embrosk squinted, trying to make out their faces in the darkness. However, all he could see were silhouettes in the flames. "What's going on?" he asked. "The last thing I remember is falling asleep after Abio gave me a potion." The elves laughed together. "Abio? Who is Abio?" one of the male elves asked. Embrosk groaned in frustration. Were all elves like this? "Abio was an elf who I met recently," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "He was small, with dark skin and hair. He must have been the one to leave me here with you." The elves laughed again. To Embrosk, it sounded rather conspiratorial. "We don't have anyone like that here," the female elf said, her sly grin illuminated by the flickering flames of the fire. "How did I get here, then?" Embrosk heard in his own voice that he was becoming defensive. "Why would you care how you got here?" the female elf asked. "You're already here." "Yes," another elf chimed in. "There's something far more important." "Exactly," the third elf said. "It would be much more productive to discuss where you're going." "Where I'm going?" Embrosk asked. "What's going on here?" Before the elves could answer, he felt a chill down his spine. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And Embrosk knew exactly what it was. No, it couldn't be. He knelt down and began to paw the ground around him. No, no. How on earth could this happen? Every time that the music had taken him over, he had awoken with his books by his side. His eternal source of comfort, the familiar canvas of the bag, always just within reach. But now... "Where are my books?" Embrosk roared at the top of his lungs. "What did you do with them?" The elf's smiles did not falter. "Only you know," the female elf said, while her companions tittered amusedly. Embrosk could feel his hands physically shaking with anger. "Of course I don't know. What did you do with my books?" "We didn't do anything with your books," the older of the two male elves said, smiling broadly at Embrosk. It was Abio. Embrosk knew it. He had trusted an elf. He had drank the potion even when his instincts told him not to. This was his fault. "I don't care," Embrosk said through gritted teeth. "Those books are all I have. I've lost control over my mind. I've lost control over my body. Those books..." He choked back a dry sob of anguish. "Those books are everything to me." "Then go and find them," the older elf said, his eyes glinting in the flames. "Find them where?" Embrosk demanded, taking a step forwards towards the elf. Though he was short for a human, he was a giant in comparison to the small, pointy-eared nuisance. The elf did not flinch. "You know where," he said simply. Embrosk felt tears spring to his eyes once again. His anger was suddenly trumped by his desperation. "Please," he pleaded, "where are my books?" The female elf sighed in exasperation. "Look at the fire," she chirped, as if this were an obvious thing to do. "What?" Embrosk asked. Do it, she snapped back. With no other option, he stared into the red-hot embers that were all that was left of a once roaring flame. And in his head, he began to hear something. It was a gentle strumming, a pale imitation of the true thing, but beautiful nonetheless. It was as if the music had died, and he now listened to the faint whispers of its ghost. But still, it told him all he needed to know. And there, in the back of his mind, strumming the harp of this imitation music, was... You, Embrosk said, ripping his eyes away from the fire and staring directly at the female elf. What are you doing in my mind? She did not have the grace to look embarrassed. I'm answering your question. You're controlling my thoughts, he retorted. How is this possible? It is possible, the young male elf said. It is possible through the magic of the elves, through the bonds of communal magic. Embrosk was already shaking his head before the elf had finished speaking. No, you need permission to form a bond of communal magic. I did not give that to you. Yes, you did, said the female elf. You asked a question, and then when I bid you look into the fire, you did so, expecting, if only for a moment, to find an answer there. That was the permission I needed to establish the bond, a bond formed to answer your query. Embrosk had never experienced connection through communal magic before. He had always wondered what it would feel like. He had wondered what it would be like to connect to another person and have a deep bond of understanding and acceptance between them, to the point that they could share one another's minds and magic. But this had merely been a trick, and Embrosk felt violated. For months he had been out of control of his body. Now he could no longer trust his mind. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an apology, a release from the spell of the music and the return of the books. But he knew already that such a demand would be futile, and the words never left his mind. The sun was beginning to rise, and its pale light illuminated the faces of the three elves. He looked up at the female elf who had broken into his mind. She stared at him, her pointed face framed by her short black hair, her dark eyes piercing him. The humor was gone from her face, but still, there was no shame. She ought to feel ashamed, Embrosk thought. You know what you need to do, chirped one of the elves in his high-pitched voice, staring up at Embrosk. He was the shortest of the bunch, and his head was bald. He had wrinkles along his bare arms, indicating that he was the oldest of the trio. You just have to find the strength to do it. You think I want to listen to you? Embrosk retorted, feeling the rage begin to bubble up in his stomach once again. You who stole from me, who enchanted me with magic, who took control of my mind? The elf smiled as if Embrosk was naive to be so upset. You will listen to us because we know, and so do you, what lies at the end of your path. Your books are there, yes, but so is something far more important. Embrosk swallowed hard. The elf could be telling the truth. Embrosk's life goal could finally be in sight. But he was far too cynical to believe that now, especially from these thieves. You lied, Embrosk repeated in a low voice. You stole, you entered my mind, and I cannot trust what you say. Of course you can, the elf said. Kiana might not be used to human standards of etiquette, and perhaps she should have asked more explicitly before creating the bond. But that's no reason not to trust us. I'll give a reason not to trust you then, Embrosk said, lowering his voice even further. How about the other scholars, the ones whose bodies are littered throughout the fallen kingdom of Cadman? They also followed your music, and now they are dead. To Embrosk's surprise, the older elf nodded. Yes, he said, they are dead. He let a long pause hang in the air before he locked eyes with Embrosk yet again. You too will be dead, quite soon, if you continue to resist. Kiana showed you the truth. She showed you the path. Now follow it. Listen and you will know the way, the younger of the two male elves said. Listen hard and you will know the why, Kiana finished. She spoke with finality. The sky had begun to turn light pink as the day became lighter and the sun started to peek out from the horizon. The fire had already burned down to a small pile of smoldering embers. Embrosk looked around. They were in a small clearing encircled by large hardwood trees. The makeshift fire pit sat in the exact center of the clearing. Near the edge of the clearing there were several large bags, much like the one that Abio had been carrying. Abio. Who the hell was Abio? He was the one behind this, Embrosk was sure. The elf had stolen his books. Somehow he had put him under his spell. He had transported Embrosk to this clearing. He had killed the other lost scholars. Embrosk studied the elves in the light of the rising sun. He was used to real experiences, dispelling the myths that he had heard since childhood. After meeting the ogres of Botsere, Embrosk could not believe that all ogres ate children. After seeing his first dragon, he could no longer believe that a dragon laid waste to a city. Still, the evil stories of elves and their spiteful trickery rang in Embrosk's head. In that moment, the ancient stories rang true. As Embrosk dwelled on what the elves had done to him, he felt a fire of rage begin to kindle in his belly. He was fixated on it. He could not think. He could not hear what the old elf was now saying, for he didn't much care. There was nothing that these murderers and thieves could say to appease him. The fire burned hotter. The elf took a step back. He barely saw Kiana and Castor, connected through communal magic, tell their oldest companion to flee. The older elf was still saying something to him. He was pleading. He was informing. He was telling Embrosk something important. And still, Embrosk didn't care. 4 years of his life had disappeared. They were using him. They did not care if he lived or died. The fire grew hotter and hotter inside Embrosk until finally the short, skinny, mild-mannered potioneer, who had for his entire life abhorred the violence of personal magic, produced a wave of heat and energy that tore through the air, throwing the bald, wrinkled elf to the floor. Embrosk could not tell if the elf was badly injured, and he didn't much care. As soon as the blast left Embrosk, he felt his shoulders slump forward. He felt his eyes begin to shut with the exhausting energy of the magic he had used. And, in the back of his mouth, he tasted a strange metallic flavor. He crumpled to the ground, and his eyes shut. Kiana and her younger companion pulled themselves to their feet. They had been hit by the blast, but nowhere near as forcefully as Calyx. Through their communal bond, they poured some of their strength into him, and quickly the burns on his face began to heal, and his broken bones began to mend. When he was safe to transport, Castor slung Calyx over his shoulder, Kiana lending him some of her strength. Moving slowly and carefully, they disappeared through the trees and into the forest. Prior to their meeting, Kiana had been uncertain whether they would succeed. But as always, Calyx and Abio had been right. They had pointed the human down the path. They had warned him of the consequences that would arise if he did not follow. And this was the part she had been unsure of. Using just the subtlest hints of communal magic, she had convinced him to lash out, and to lash out using violent magic. They now had everything they needed. She sent a message through her communal bond that it was time to bring in the ogre. Oh look, the night has passed quickly, and the moon is high in the sky. And so, yet again, I must pause the telling of this tale. But fear not. When 7 days have passed, we may reunite here by the flickering light of the fire to continue Embrosk's story. In the meantime, spread the word that this is a place where stories are told. Tell your friends near and far that there is room for them around this hearth, so we can continue to tell this wondrous tale of gold, bones, and leather. Before I sign off today, I want to remind all of you guys that if you're enjoying the podcast, please head over to my website, bensbookshack.com, to check out some of the amazing original artwork that accompanies this podcast. It really helps bring the scenes to life, and it was done by the amazingly talented Celeste Schiff. If you want to see any of her other work, her portfolio is linked in the show notes down below. As always, a major thank you to everyone who helped make this podcast possible. Anais, Tasha, Kira, and Madison, I'm looking at you guys. And last but not least, thank you to all of you guys who are here listening to Embrosk's story. Truly, nothing could make me happier. And I hope that you'll join me next week as I continue to tell this story of gold, bones, and leather. The Gold, Bones, and Leather podcast is brought to you by Ben's Bookshack. Everything that you've heard on this episode, including music, was written, recorded, and edited by me. I can be reached at contact@bensbookshack.com.